the picture illustrate about British control over the American colonies for most of the colonial period? The king paid little attention to the colonies in the beginning. The colonies made their own rules and decisions. A separate government was created by the colonists. What does this picture illustrate about British control over the American colonies after the war the British had finished fighting against the French? It shows that the control over the colonies was tightened. The war left Britain in much debt. The king decided to turn to the colonies for profit. What basic ideas did colonists use when they created their governments? They decided that the government will get its power from the people in return for protection. This guaranteed that the government can't have too much power and can be overthrown if the rights of the people are violated. The social contract was one of the many basic ideas the colonists used in creating their government. What was the result of the colonial resistance? Britain began creating the Intolerable Acts. The Stamp and Quartering Acts were some of the acts passed. The king used these acts as a form of punishment. They were also used to profit off the colonies. How did the Boston Massacre change the way some colonists thought about British rule? The massacre served as propaganda. It showed how terribly the British treated the colonies. It made it almost necessary for the colonists to rebel against Britain. Why did the British government tighten control over the colonies? Britain had finished fighting a war against the French. They wanted to use the colonies to pay those debts and profit. The British felt that the colonies were responsible for a portion of their debts. What ideas of constitutional government did the colonists use in creating their governments? Rule of law. Everyone had to obey the laws. Self-government. Government of a country by its own people. Natural rights. Life, liberty, and property can't be taken away from citizens. Separation of powers. Government split into equal parts or branches. Common law. Based on custom and the decisions of law court. What happened at the First Continental Congress? 12 of the state representatives met in Philadelphia. They decided on how to respond to the British actions. 56 delegates from most of the colonies drafted a Declaration of Rights. Why was it necessary for the colonists to create their own colonial governments? The British paid little attention to the colonies. A government was needed so that the colonies could function. The colonies needed some type of system in order to make decisions. Why did the colonists feel that the laws passed by Parliament violated their rights? They were no longer under British rule, yet they still had to pay unfair taxes. The king and Parliament believed they had the right to tax the colonies. These taxes violated their rights as British citizens. Why did the British believe that the tax and trade laws were fair? King George thought that the colonists were acting like ungrateful children. The British believed that the colony's safety was due to them. Britain claimed that the well-being of the colonists were because of them. What tax and trade laws did Parliament pass? What was the purpose of those acts? What effects did the laws passed by Parliament have on the colonists? Parliament had passed the Intolerable Acts. They were made to restore authority to the colonies. This made it even more difficult for colonists to pay their debts and taxes. Why did the British begin to tighten control over the colonies after 1763? To reduce the national debt. The king questioned colonists' loyalty and tightened his grip on them. The British believed they were protecting the colonists.
King George III refused to consider the concerns mentioned by colonial leaders in the Declaration and Resolves, and in May of 1775, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies met again in Philadelphia for what became known as the Second Continental Congress. What did the delegates discuss there? Although far from unified, the delegates had several pressing issues to deal with. Some called for war with Britain, while others insisted that peace should still be sought. Once again, compromise would be needed. While they did not vote to openly rebel against the crown, the representatives expressed their growing dissatisfaction with George III and Parliament. The delegates decided to request that each of the 13 colonies draft a new state constitution, and the large militia besieging Boston was declared the Continental Army. Since the soldiers were all New Englanders, many argued that someone from New England should be named commander. John Hancock felt that he should be given command, since he was one of the wealthiest and most respected men from the area. But John Adams saw the importance of naming a non-Yankee general. He was determined to name a stout, engaging militia leader from Virginia to be the commander. First, Adams's candidate was 43. He wasn't too old to function, but not too young to command respect. He had been a leading figure in the colonial resistance for several years and had a substantial military background during the French and Indian War. In fact, he had more military experience than any other American. Finally, he was Virginian. His selection would show that the struggle wasn't merely a Boston or New England matter, but something all of the colonies supported. Upon being nominated, the Virginian left the room so the others could discuss openly. After the debate, George Washington was unanimously voted the leader of the Continental Army. In July, Congress sent the Olive Branch Petition to George III as a final attempt to avoid conflict. It blamed Parliament for the war and asked George III to call off the fighting for peace talks. John Adams was disgusted by the document, but signed it anyway. George III refused the petition and sent the Royal Navy to blockade the colonies. He also authorized Parliament to hire 18,000 German Hessians from Europe. These professional soldiers for hire, known as mercenaries, had a particularly ruthless reputation, and the king believed that the Hessians would bring the colonists to their knees. When word of the king's agreement with several German princes reached the colonies, many argued that the act was solid proof that George III was an enemy of American liberty. As General Washington began to put his staff together in preparation to depart for Boston, news of a major battle and British atrocities in and around the city began to trickle in. Benjamin Franklin, who had left Britain to take a seat in the Continental Congress, wrote one of his companions back in London, "Mr. Strahan, you are a member of Parliament, and one of that majority which has doomed my country to destruction. You have begun to burn our towns and murder our people. Look upon your hands. They are stained with the blood of your relations. You and I were long friends. You are now my enemy, and I am yours." Benjamin Franklin.